Hello and welcome back. So today we're talking about ethics, specifically applied ethics. And so what applied ethics is it addresses particular moral questions like, is it right to have an abortion? Is capital punishment right or wrong? That's distinct from what we sometimes call meta ethics, which is more generally about the nature of right and wrong. What makes the things that are right right? Is it because, it helps people, right? Produces pleasure for more people than it causes pain. That would be one approach to ethics. It's called utilitarianism. Other approaches say no, there are hard and fast moral rules that we can get either from God or from pure reason. Um, so that's an interesting subject. It's a little more abstract. We're going to focus in on a very specific subject here, which is cultural appropriation. Sorry. And in fact, we're going to focus even more closely because involves many things. Even defining what a culture is a tricky question, but we know it when we see it. Culture involves forms of art, forms of agriculture, right? And we're going to talk about today one particular form of art, which is music, right? And specifically hip hop. So the question we're going to basically ask today is, should white people be rapping, right? Or is this a black form of music that is used, right, by white people to make money when often black artists don't make as much money? So this is, it's happened with rock and roll. It's happened with multiple art forms where black people, particularly in the United States, will invent something wonderful and not be paid for it, and instead white people end up making most of the money. So something about that seems wrong, and we're trying to hone in on what exactly is going wrong here. So this lecture is sort of carved up into three parts. So first, a little context, and the reading is sort of a compilation of short essays from various authors. So we get to see lots of different viewpoints on this subject, different accounts of, some people say, no, white people rapping is not wrong, right? It's perfectly fine. That's the way music works. People just borrow from each other. Black people borrow from white culture and white people borrow from black culture and other cultures. And that's just the nature of art. Other people say, yes, it is wrong for reason A, and other people say it's wrong, but for reason B. So we'll see a lot of different viewpoints, and you're free to, agree with one or disagree with one or come up with your own or write your own essay, deciding why, arguing why you think one particular viewpoint is the right one or one is the wrong. So again, today we're going to focus on race and music, even more narrowly, really on hip hop. When we're talking about cultural appropriation, it's a much larger discussion, like food, speech, clothing, religious practice. These are all could be forms. These are all aspects of a culture. And if uh, take something from someone else's culture and take it for yourself, is that appropriation? Is that wrong? Right? And so we've seen it. You'll see it in multiple uh, uh, different ways. Students and past students have pointed out to me, I believe it was Haley Bieber, Justin Bieber's wife, putting on lip liner in a way that's traditionally something that Latinas have done, and kind of pretending that she invented it. Things like that can also be cultural appropriation. So some big picture questions: is cultural appropriation wrong at all, right? Or is it perfectly fine if you see someone doing something in another culture that you think is great and you want to do it too, right? Is that perfectly fine? Or is there a problem with it? If it is wrong, is it always wrong? Or are there some instances where I could respectfully borrow from another culture? Um, and if it's not always wrong, then what makes it wrong and what makes it right in the cases where it's wrong, right? Um, and if it's never wrong, right? If it's always okay, then why does there seem to be sort of a broad kind of ick factor in certain circumstances where, someone is sort of taking from another culture. Again, when it comes to ethics, uh, we do take as evidence our moral intuitions, right? So we see someone, you see me walk into class and I kick a puppy, and your first instinct is going to be, that's terrible, right? You haven't necessarily reasoned it out yet, but you had an initial intuition. That's wrong. And we tend to follow our intuitions, and broadly they seem to be correct. We count them as evidence, right? That you have a general understanding of right and wrong, and that your intuitions, right, your gut instincts, reflect that. And so we take those as evidence. So when it seems like in some cases, when someone's doing something or borrowing from another culture, it feels like not cool to us, we need to explain what that is, right? Why is it not cool? Or why does it not feel cool if we decide that it actually is always okay? So those, guiding questions are going to help frame these things we read. So uh, focusing on music, right, and hip hop. So, here's two examples of two white artists that elicit very different intuitions from people. So not everybody, I think most everybody is familiar with Eminem, um, and he's generally accepted, right, as a talented rapper. And typically, there's not a lot of reaction that he's somehow appropriating a culture or doing something wrong, right? Iggy Azalea, which these days people are sometimes less familiar with. I encourage you with all of these. When we're doing this in class in person, I'll play videos from each of these artists. It's a little more difficult uh, in the context of this PowerPoint video, but feel free to go to YouTube, and yeah, if you haven't heard of Iggy Azalea, check her out. Right, there's one of her songs, "Fancy," is a pretty good example of what people are talking about. A lot of people look at her, so she's a white Australian lady. Um, Seems to be kind of appropriating a black way of talking and speaking, and some people look at her and it feels offensive to them, right? So Eminem, Iggy Azalea, two white artists doing hip hop, and yet we seem to have different intuitions, or broadly people do. Eminem seems okay. A lot of people think Iggy Azalea not okay, right? So why? What's the difference? Is what we're going to try to figure out. So that's Eminem. There's Iggy Azalea. How does success factor into the difference between syncretism, which is a word for, like, just mashing up cultural styles in a pleasant aesthetic way, and appropriation, which is kind of we take to be a bad thing. So Bruno Mars is not actually black, um, but seems to, take on some stereotypically sort of black mannerisms, right? Um, is that right? Is that wrong? Does it matter if he's very popular, right, or very talented? Does that make a difference? Um, should artists be excused for their appropriation when their music helps or steers attention towards black artists? So this Paul Simon's Graceland was a very popular album when I was growing up. So what the background there? Paul Simon, a white singer-songwriter who in the 80s went to South Africa to collaborate with some black South African musicians. It was during the apartheid time, and so it was very controversial. Anyone going to South Africa at all, because the government there was racist and enforcing segregation. But Paul Simon said, well, I like these musicians. I want to work with these musicians. I'm going to pay them well. I'm going to let everybody know, hey, you should, if you bought my album, you should buy these other albums too. And, he made some money for these folks and drew some attention to these South African artists. So does that um, excuse the fact that he made an album that borrowed a lot of from the South African musical styles of the black artists there, or not? So, there's a number of options of, like, approaches you could take. You could say appropriation is wrong. If so, this is a philosophy class. You owe us reasons, right? If you make a moral judgment, I should be able to ask you, well, why is it wrong? And you should have an answer. So there's some answers out there, we'll see some offered by the authors in the article you read, right? So you might say, look, it's always wrong, right? And it's always wrong because fill in the blank, right? We'll see some answers to that later. You might say, sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. It depends on, it's like Eminem. You might say, well, look, he grew up in Detroit. He grew up poor. It's not that he's like a rich person, right? Taking from a musical form from a lower class. He's sort of a working class uh, person, and he's speaking about his experience or something like that. In which case, you might say it's not wrong. That's an answer I've heard some people give. Um, power asymmetries, right? So we'll see a lot of people say, look, it's not so much about race, actually, it's about power, right? It's about a group with power taking from a group with less power. Um, Again, that explanation might seem to make Eminem okay because he didn't come from a group with power. Depending on how you define that, right? Just being white gives you some implicit um, power in this culture, but that's another approach we'll see more in detail about that, sort of saying, well, the race is not the primary issue, it's the power dynamics. Right? Other people will say, look, whether appropriation is moral or immoral depends on like whether you do it well, right? So if you're one of those people that thinks Eminem is good at it and Iggy Azalea is not so good at it, then you might say that's why we don't think it's okay for Iggy Azalea, but it's okay for Eminem. In that case, it's just a purely aesthetic judgment. And these these can be mixed and matched and combined um, in whatever position you want to take, right? Um, or, right, another position you could take is no, appropriation isn't wrong. You can always borrow from anything. It's art, right? Just if you see something you like and you want to do it, go ahead, do it, right? But again, you need to give us a reason. Why isn't it wrong, right? And some of the authors we'll see will hold that position and try to explain it as well. Okay, so here are some arguments from the reading that you did that are against cultural appropriation that say it's wrong for white people to rap, basically. Right? So here's Lau, and he argues that it's all about power dynamics, right? So um, when we talk about identity categories like race, gender, class, these can all be subsumed under a larger issue, which is power. People that have power and people that don't have power, right? So we need to start our analysis with that, right? Um, Now, he doesn't think that somehow you can achieve racial transcendence where that, Eminem no longer becomes sort of a white person and he's sort of beyond. He thinks that's not the case because, again, this stuff is enforced. This stuff is beyond you. I can't transcend my race because it's sort of imposed on me by these systems of power. So he's got a power first sort of orientation. Um, Now, this is a deeper question and that people get into in philosophy of race, right? But Lau is taking the position, which many people take, that race isn't actually like a basic natural category, right? It's something that's actually created within a certain political or social dynamic. So, for example, the ancient Greeks didn't really think in terms of race, right? You might have, they would have thought in terms of like, this is my tribe or this is my city state, and these are people that speak my language, people that don't speak my language, but they didn't really have a concept of white people, right, and brown people. That's not how they carved up um, people groups, right? The arguments in the literature say, our current um, conception of race is a relatively recent development around the U.S. and the sort of economic and slave trade and colonial system that grew up, right? And so it's a relatively recent thing, and it's not a necessary or natural category. It's something people basically make up. So he thinks that to focus on race, um, right, or gender, any of these categories, is to focus on the wrong thing. We should be focusing on the power relations, right? And so, you know, to make it clear, if you think that a cultural appropriation is wrong and you care about the power relations, then what you would have to say is it's wrong for someone from a more powerful group, right, to take uh, cultural forms from a less powerful group, but then it wouldn't necessarily be wrong the other way around. So if a black jazz artist wants to use some classical music forms that were developed in Germany 100 years ago, you'd say that's perfectly fine, but not the other way around, right? I can't take from people that are in a less powerful group. And you do have to keep in mind that all these different categories overlap and reinforce each other. So race, gender, economic forces, um, they're what we call intersecting, right? And so, someone can end up on the winning end of all those power dynamics, right? And be rich and white and male. You can end up on the losing end of all those power dynamics. And that's being in that situation is distinct from just being black. Being a black woman is a different thing from just being a black person, would argue Lau, right? So again, if we think that Iggy Azalea is doing something wrong, according to Lau, it wouldn't be just that she's doing uh, music that is traditionally or that was invented by black people. Um, it's that she's doing it and making money off it when many black people are not making comparable amounts of money, right? This is an old phenomenon, right? So Elvis, you're probably familiar with Elvis, right? Um, he's doing music that had been done by black artists, but when he does it, he's a good-looking guy. He's white. He's not threatening to, um, the very conservative sort of culture at the time in the 50s, and he makes a ton of money, right, doing something that, again, black artists just weren't going to make that amount of money. They weren't even allowed to play in a lot of the same clubs. I don't know if you know Chuck Berry, who is a famous, early rock and roll guy. People didn't know he was black, and he would show up to the club ready to play, and they'd be like, "Oh, no, you can't play. You're black," kind of thing. So there were systematic barriers, right, to black artists making lots of money off the art form they invented. Someone like Elvis comes in, makes all the money, right, without having to do as much of the hard work. And you might think that's what's wrong with someone like Iggy Azalea, right? She's making off with all the money without really having to do all the work. All right. So let's move on to the next person. So that's Lau's approach. So here's Mathis. Again, a power analysis of what's going on with cultural appropriation, right? He's saying problems with appropriation are rooted in imbalances of power, and what makes some particular instance of cultural appropriation wrong or harmful is it, quote, manifests and exacerbates inequality and marginalization. So if it is reinforcing, right, and is a result of these power structures that are unfair, uh, that's what makes it wrong. Now, it just so happens that in the US, arguably the primary manifestation of our power imbalances, well, some people would disagree if they're Marxists or people more focused on economy, but lots of people say it's race, right? The United States has a particularly difficult and ugly history with regard to race, and that's one of the main ways that our power structure manifests inequality, right? So that's why in the US, right, when we're talking about cultural appropriation, it seems like we're worried about race, but he says, no, it's really the power structures, right? And he points out race and culture are not necessarily the same thing, right? Um, so, right, just just because you're black or just because you're white doesn't necessarily mean that you are participating in stereotypically black or white culture, right? Different things. Um, and he says, if from this power analysis, right, then we could see situations where we wouldn't call it appropriation, we would call it collaboration or participation, right? So, if it's not a situation of someone with more power taking a cultural form from someone else and using it to reinforce their power and make money, but instead it's genuine collaboration where, all parties are sort of uplifted or there's no difference in the power dynamic, then that could be okay, right? And that's going to be a result of any of these power analyses of cultural appropriation, which is to say that, yeah, if it's power imbalance is the problem. If there's no power imbalance, then there's no problem. Right? So you can have people borrowing from other cultures as long as it's not a bad power dynamic. Right? All right. So again, both Lau and Mathis have similar viewpoints in that it's the power imbalance that is the problem with cultural appropriation, not necessarily playing different types of music in itself. Now here's Coleman. She takes a different view. She doesn't want to focus on power dynamics, and instead something else, which not entirely clear what she thinks that something else is. She talks about law. She does seem to think in some way it's a legal issue, right? Of what can we rightfully take according to the law, right? But in a rightfully, it's kind of broader than legal, I think, right? So, for example, one kind of appropriation that she would think is wrong is if it's purposely done to mock or offend another group, right? So if you were just, again, making fun of people using racial stereotypes, that would be wrong, right? That would be a bad form of cultural appropriation. We've seen, in the past, right, the practice of the minstrel shows and white people in blackface, that seems to be, deliberately offensive and mocking, and so that's obviously wrong. Right? But there might be other kinds of appropriation that are done out of genuine appreciation. That seems to be what Paul Simon was doing when he went to South Africa to work with these artists. He said, I really love this music. I really want to make an album with these people. Right? So we'll see more of this, but particularly with music, I mean, borrowing is just kind of the name of the game. It's always been that way. Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but the way music happens is people take styles from wherever they can. If they see a good idea or a nice hook, right, people will take it on, right? So this seems to be the norm. It's not necessarily an exception in music. It seems to be almost the nature of music. So, according to Coleman, right, you can borrow respectfully, or you can uh, borrow appropriate in a wrong way. So it's misappropriation if it's done wrong, right? But what exactly makes it wrong, right? Do we have a clear criteria for when am I misappropriating or am I borrowing correctly? And she seems to say that it's when it transgresses some legal right, uh, which is sort of strange because you might think, well, laws can be wrong, right? And if the laws are wrong, right, it once was legal to own slaves in the United States. Obviously, that was a bad law. So how could you frame your morality in terms of legality? But maybe this helps. She understood legal in a pluralistic sense, right? So legal, to say something is legal is not just according to, U.S. law that was the U.S. Constitution that was written primarily by, white people in the 1700s kind of thing, but it could be pluralistic. So, in Australia, you have Aboriginal people and they have their own legal system, and that one is just as justified as any other legal system. So here's her quote. Cultural appropriation is not something that should be condoned when the appropriator is from the less dominant culture, right? So this, she's saying, specifically against the power analysis. She says, just because you're not in a position of power doesn't mean it's necessarily okay to appropriate, right? Any more than when a dominant culture assumes that which is traditional cannot be owned by right. If we're to avoid trivializing the concept of cultural appropriation, so she wants to say, through thinking that all cultural traditions are owned or thinking that cultural forms cannot be owned because cultures are not bounded groups, we need to refer to the traditional legal rights of people, right? So what she wants to say is we want to be able to say that it's sometimes right, it's sometimes wrong, and she doesn't want to focus on power, and she doesn't want to focus even on culture. Instead, she thinks it's better to talk about the traditional legal rights of people, but this is in a very broad sense. It's not the same as just the laws that are on the books, right? But the laws that come with your traditional people, right? She seems to want to avoid the issue of culture altogether, right? Okay, so those were some folks that were against cultural appropriation and trying to explain why it's wrong, right? Mostly in terms of power dynamic, which was what made it wrong. Um, but there's other people that want to talk about different criteria that would make it right or wrong. Okay. So Stroll has a sort of a pluralist view. He says, well, there's lots of reasons and lots of ways cultural appropriation can be wrong, and they're not all relevant in every single context, right? So, we've looked at race, gender, respect, and power. These are all in play, right? So actually, I didn't explicitly say it, but some people would say, why do we think Eminem is okay, but Iggy Azalea isn't? Some people would say, well, it's because she's a woman, right? And we're just, people can't handle women being successful, and that's why people have this intuition that it's wrong for her to rap, but actually that's bad, right? That's just being sexist, right? That's a possible view you could take as well, right? So um, all of these are potentially in play, right? Um, are you from a more powerful group, taking from a less powerful group? Are you doing your borrowing with respect, or right? Are you doing it in an attempt to ridicule or an attempt to just steal, right? Um, all of these might be right, right? They can all be correct at once, right? Um, so could the differences in reception between various white rappers really be about harm, right? Or the relation to larger legal power structures? And Stroll says no. He says it's not that, most white rappers are not like um, powerful bankers or something, right? They tend to, uh, maybe they might be middle class. Typically, they tend to be, right, working class folks, right? So they don't um, necessarily have a particularly meaningfully higher power, right, uh, than their black contemporaries. Now, I think some people would disagree with this, right? Some people would say, look, having white skin is an automatic form of power that you don't always recognize, right? They'll call it privilege, right? They say, look, you've got white privilege, you don't even see it. Even if you grew up poor, if you grew up poor and white, you have certain privileges, right? So Stroll seems to disagree with that in this context, right? Um, So maybe it's about authenticity, right? Maybe Eminem seems more authentic because he comes from Detroit and so on. But Stroll thinks that can't be the whole story, right? Could it be gender? Gender could be part of it, but it can't be the whole story. Um, so not all women who borrow are like Iggy Azalea, right? There um, are arguably some white women who've done hip hop that people would say it's okay, right? Or borrowed from other cultural forms, and people think that's fine. Um, so you might argue that the problem is some level of disrespect towards the forum. How do we cash that out, right? What is Iggy doing? If she is doing something disrespectful, what is that, right? Um, it could be explained, right? But if you were to write a paper on this, you'd want to explain that. Um, Macklemore, right? Who again, I don't know if he's popular anymore, but another white rapper, not as respected generally as Eminem, and what this author says is, by all appearances, Macklemore's main problem is that he sucks, right? Um, and in particular, maybe he's trying too hard, which is kind of a specific kind of suckiness that's inauthentic, right? So, is it a purely aesthetic consideration, right? Is appropriation okay if you do it well and it's a great song, and it's wrong if you do it badly and it sucks, right? Um, there's a quote: "It's not that Eminem is less complicit in oppressive power structures than Macklemore; it's that he acknowledges this in a more forthright, palatable way." And certainly there is something about, Eminem was sort of brought in by, he was sort of a protege of Dr. Dre, and he's always sort of acknowledged his debt to black music and to black people and to Dre in particular. And so maybe that's part of it. That's maybe part of why people don't have as much of a problem with Eminem. But again, on this pluralist view, that's not the whole story, right? There's going to have to be lots of factors going on. And so there's Macklemore. Um, so maybe there's a bunch of explanatory factors. Maybe it's talent in part. Maybe it's authenticity in part. Maybe it's being respectful in part. Maybe it's gender, right? It's easier maybe for men than for women. Maybe forthrightness about your racial politics, right? Saying in interviews and stuff, hey, I recognize, right, this dynamic that's going on. Beastie Boys, another example, don't seem to be generally accepted. They were pretty early in hip hop world, which may be part of it, right? They seem to be in some way authentic because they were there more or less at the beginning. Rick Rubin, one of the producers, was white as well, an early producer. Although it's funny, in teaching this, Rick Rubin seemed to me like, oh, he was right there inventing it, right, along with all the black artists. But then the more you look into it, and he actually, that style of just a drum machine beat and an MC and not much else, not like all the samples. Um, uh, that was actually invented by a black DJ, and he sort of like borrowed that style. So, um, but it's tricky when they're there at the beginning, right? It was from the beginning a lot of cooperation, right? Um, so here's maybe Stroll thinks some important factors that haven't been recognized yet. Um, a difference between what he calls subtractive and syncretic borrowing. So syncretic is the good kind, right? You are mashing up styles and creating something new. Subtractive means you're just taking. So he argues that Iggy Azalea is just doing hip hop, but kind of stripping away the blackness to make it more appealing to white people. Arguably, that's what Elvis was doing too. Whereas the Beastie Boys are collaborating and trying to create something new and interesting, right? Adding their, sort of white Jewish approach to a black musical form instead of just doing hip hop but making it whiter. Arguably, how you tell the difference between those two is an open question, right? Um, he thinks the answer to that could be found in the narrative about the artists in the community, understanding their story. You could maybe figure out if they're doing the subtractive or the syncretic kind. So people like Miley, I don't know, he's just saying that these people suck. Obviously, this is aesthetic judgment. If some of you really love Miley Cyrus or Macklemore, I'm not arguing with you. This is just this author's analysis, right? But he says it's not just that if you think they suck, it's not just because they suck, but it's also what makes them not as good is that they're doing it in a not very innovative or reductive way, right? They're just borrowing the culture and like doing a bad Xerox copy of it instead of trying to enrich it and do something new with it. Okay, so here's a couple of views that say cultural appropriation is not really a thing and it's fine. This is what musicians do, right? So here's Taiwo, and he says, this whole thing seems very hostile to artists and art, right? Making all these rules about what you can and can't do. He says, look, if you actually look at the history of cultural borrowing, it's super complicated, right? It's not just a simple story of black people inventing all the cool stuff and then white people running away with it and making the money. So if you look at the details, right, you get a different story. So right? Music is centuries and centuries of cross-cultural exchange. So what does it mean to inappropriately borrow it? It seems like by its nature, it is just borrowing, right? So here's his quote. The actual history of music, of course, defies a kind of neat conceptual division. Take influential figures in black music, for instance. Nina Simone's early musical training was entirely in Western classical music. And if, as I mentioned, these artists, look them up, listen to them. They're all great, right? So if you're not familiar with some of these artists, I encourage you to check them out. So yeah, Nina Simone, great female black artist, and she was trained classically in Western classical. John Coltrane, black musician, took a giant step forward within jazz, which was an African diasporic form of music, but his leap happened after studying a Russian composer. And he was playing on an instrument that was invented by a German. So again, you have all this mix of culture. It almost seems impossible to pull it apart. Miles Davis and his other innovations borrowed from some musical modes that were developed in Greece, right? Not Namibia. So he's just saying, even the most purist sort of like black expressions of culture and of music, they borrow, right? Everybody borrows. There's Alexis McLeod also saying, yeah, cultural appropriation, not a thing. He says it's always okay, right? Um, and he has an argument here, right? We have actual discrete premises and a conclusion, which is nice. So premise one, cultural goods are ideas or ways of acting. Premise two, ideas and ways of acting can't be owned. So, if you have whatever, if you come up with a cool new style where you tuck in your shirt in a very specific way, I can look at that and say, wow, that's cool. Tuck in my shirt in that way, and you can't sue me, right? That's just a way of acting. You can't own a way of acting, right? Um, so that means cultures can't own things, right? If a culture is just an idea and a way of acting, and you can't own those things, then cultures can't own things, right? Um, so there's no such thing as cultural appropriation, right? If cultural appropriation is stealing from another culture, you can't steal something that the culture doesn't own, right? So cultural appropriation doesn't exist according to McLeod. Right? Now he says there is cultural exchange, and this is typically perfectly fine, right? But then if that's the view you want to take, you do owe us an explanation of our intuitions, right? If you watch Iggy Azalea perform and you think it hits me weird, something seems wrong about this, which a lot of people seem to feel, then uh, you owe us an explanation of our intuitions. Why did our intuitions go wrong in this case, right? And he says the answer is there's something wrong with it, but it's not cultural appropriation. It's adjacent, right? So maybe it's an aesthetic thing, right? Um, but it reduces to some other kind of harm, right? It's cultural appropriation. He says is doesn't exist because cultures can't own things. But if something gives you an ick feeling and it looks like cultural appropriation, maybe it's because it's just bad, right? Maybe Eminem doesn't bother you because he's good at it, and if Iggy Azalea bothers you, maybe it's because she's not good at it. Right? So it's an aesthetic harm, and that's bad in a sense aesthetically. Um, it can be a moral harm. It's not the cultural appropriation necessarily, right? But again, well, he calls it silencing black women. Um, how do you explain that in a sense that is not cultural? At least, how do you explain if that's what Iggy Azalea is doing? Um, seems all she's doing is borrowing a style, and if that counts um, as a harm, I mean, I guess he can make sense of that. That part is, I think, needs more explanation, right? If you're promoting stereotypes, right? Again, if it's the minstrel show with the blackface, obviously that's a moral harm, but it's not the appropriation, right? It's not um, borrowing from the culture that's the wrong thing. It's the presenting a vicious stereotype that's the wrong thing, or just the racism of it, right? Or just material harms, right? So if you are, literally stealing, uh, a lick or a riff that you heard a black jazz musician play and you turn it into a song and make a lot of money on it and don't pay that person, then yeah, that would be wrong too. So um, here the argument is there's something wrong in some of these cases, but it's not wrong. It's not the cultural appropriation that's wrong. It's another something else on this list that's wrong, and that explains your intuition, right, about why it feels icky to you. Right. And finally, Young also arguing that it's fine, right? He says, well, we need an account of what actually makes cultural appropriation wrong, just not just what appears to make it wrong, right? Um, And, if you look at the subtractive versus syncretic approach that Stroll, there's a lot of authors at this point I know can try to keep them straight, right? Um, that distinction between, hey, are you engaging in this cultural form and improving it and adding your own viewpoint and making something new and interesting, or are you just kind of doing a bad Xerox copy where you take out the blackness? Young here argues that that distinction is just a purely aesthetic distinction, right? It's just, is the thing good? Is it new and interesting and good, or is it just bad, right? Um, but Young here says that's not the point. If that's your what if that's what you think is wrong with cultural appropriation, then you're not having an ethics discussion. You're having an aesthetics discussion, and that's a totally different issue, right? And you know that's a tough position to defend. He thinks it's not obvious that every case of appropriation will end up being aesthetically bad, right? It seems like you could make good music and still do it in a way that's immoral, right? Um, and even if appropriation does always turn out to be bad, that doesn't mean it's immoral. That just means it's aesthetically bad. So he's a few of these authors have said, well, what's wrong with cultural appropriation is it makes crappy music. And he's saying, well, that's not a position you can really hold because that's not a moral problem, right? That's an aesthetic problem, right? Now, I think, again, if you're using that to explain our intuitions, right? If you're one of the people that says cultural appropriation is not a thing, anybody can borrow any kind of music, and then you're trying to explain why we still don't like it. It makes us feel weird to watch Iggy Azalea. I think it's perfectly fine to say, well, your objection is not a moral one, it's an aesthetic one, right? But Young here wants to make that distinction clear, which is fine. Okay, so that is it for this. I find a lot of students get interested in this and want to write a paper on it. Feel free, but if you do, try to. The danger here is people will sometimes tend to just sort of, I want to discuss a lot of issues about cultural appropriation because it's fun for me to talk about it, which is great, but get a thesis. Find one of these authors that you agree with or disagree with, or if you have your own account of what makes cultural appropriation right or wrong, take a specific stand and argue for it, right? Um, so I will see you next time.